Hey guys, I hope you're doing good in this mental world that we find ourselves in at the beginning of 2021. This is the second in the series of Beautiful Irrationality. This conversation is with a guy called David from Canada, who I found on YouTube, who made a great video explaining to me about the dialectic and the history of the dialectic. So I asked him if he would join me in a conversation. I learned a lot. It's the opposite to how I operate, completely theoretical, very little of his own views coming through. A few here and there, but mainly he prides himself in having read the works closely that build our sort of philosophical framework. So it's about an hour long. It's pretty significant. If it's not your cup of tea, I wouldn't bother. I'd slip onto something else. If you do want to learn something and you are interested in philosophy and you're interested in the sort of the compounding nature of a conversation that happens with multiple people over time, then give it a go. See how you get on. Let me know what you enjoy, what you found difficult to get into, or maybe what other reading you went into as well. I won't keep you. It's long enough as it is. I'll leave you with the conversation right now. See you soon. How's it going?
Good, good. How are you, David?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time to do this. I appreciate it.
No problem. I'm in London, Ontario.
That's
Fun
confusing
one.
because I'm in the other London.
Oh, are you? Oh, that's fun.
Depending on how much we do on the container, we might actually get into the content as well of like the actual concept around the idea of can irrationality be beautiful, and is there room for that in our conception of man.
Sounds good to me.
David from Ontario, London, the other London, welcome to whatever this is, this emerging conversation and maybe even a dialectic on beautiful irrationality. I really appreciate you making time this morning.
Oh, thank you for having me.
The reason this has come about, as you know, is because a couple of days ago I was doing some research on rationality on YouTube, and I came across your video actually on dialectics. And it's just so good. It's just so clear. It's so helpful. It's not poncy or using more big words than are needed. And so for somebody like me, who's, I guess, an able layman, it's really perfect. So if you guys are listening and you want to get some theory and philosophy, get some good learning under your belt, then go over to David's channel. You guys should go and subscribe and check that out, and you might learn a thing or two like I have. And thankfully we've got him not quite in the flesh, but in the Zoomified version of the flesh, in real time at least. So what is it that you're up to? I think I see on your YouTube channel that you're in the academia flow of things. Talk to us about that.
Yes, I'm very much indoctrinated into the institutional paradigm. Working on my PhD now in media studies. I got into YouTube a few years ago when I was growing pretty much dissatisfied with how I was hearing certain texts spoken about, and that I didn't have any idea what was going on. So then I took it upon myself to start, reading these things, and I thought, wouldn't this be nice if I could just put these out there too? You don't have time to read 500 pages of Kant or Hegel to know what's going on there. So in that way, I'm not particularly original nor thorough, and I'd like to add that I'm much more of a reader of philosophy than a producer of philosophy. So I might be good at drawing upon other people's ideas, but as for producing my own, I often hit roadblocks. That kind of led me to start doing this, and it's picked up some degree of momentum with a fair, sizable audience that far surpassed what I could have ever expected, which is great.
Well, hopefully we'll find a nice complementary sort of conversation here then, because I'm not as good at reading the history as I am at making up ideas and seeing if they fit in the bigger story of humanity. So firstly, your channel's called Theory and Philosophy. My understanding of what I think of philosophy, just to make sure we're on the same page, it is the way we think about things. You could talk about the philosophy of intelligence or the philosophy of life or the philosophy of politics. It is the way we are thinking about those things, and often comes before we have the ability to do science on that thing. That's how I see what philosophy is. I have no idea what you mean by theory other than, the pre-practical part of something. But I'd love to hear how you would describe those two words, seeing as it's your YouTube channel name.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. And in terms of the basic traditions, you have the analytic tradition, which would belong to, I guess, more English philosophical sentiment, dealing with the works of like philosophy of science or philosophy of mind or ethics or stuff like that. On the other side, you would have continental philosophy, I guess is comprised more of what I will just say now as being a little bit more practical in its application. So it's dealing with questions about class or race or gender, like feminism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, these sorts of questions that don't necessarily rely quite as heavily as analytic philosophy on more hypothetical questions. That is, it's more prepared to deal with the world in its own terms. That is how it kind of manifests itself and the people within it. Now, as for theory, a lot of the time it's associated with French philosophy. So this is dealing with the work of Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, Gilles Deleuze, and all these other people are associated with this thing called theory. Philosophy often belongs to the Germans, so from Hegel all the way to Nietzsche. And then you have another camp, there's thought, which is often associated with Italian philosophy. So you have Italian thought, really cosmetic distinctions. A pretty basic, yet might get the point across definition is that philosophy seeks to abstract more from human experience. And I say that with a big asterisk. It seeks to move away from the actual lived daily experience and instead wants to contemplate the world and people as almost like universal categories. Whereas theory is more prepared to consider people in their day-to-day lives and how those lives both motivate the act of thinking and how thinking can change those lives in terms of praxis.
What I take from that is, in a sense, thought, theory, philosophy, in a sense, they're a bit interchangeable, but they have cultural connotations coming from different streams of thinking that's been developed over time. But in another sense, there might be some differences where the theory side of stuff is maybe a bit more concerned with people's day-to-day lived experiences.
That's how I would very basically define it.
Let's talk about this dialectic container. I just got to do this debate at Oxford Union, which was awesome, but I was very confronted by the fact that it ends up with a win-loss scenario. It's when I was looking for, well, are there other formal examples of conversation that have like a different framing to them that don't end up in like a win or lose scenario where you actually maybe move forwards together? And I found the dialectic. So I wonder if you could give a very short summary as to what the dialectic is. That would be really handy. And then I guess we can consider whether or not we think it is a useful method for pursuing this area I'm interested in.
For dealing with the dialectic, I guess the most important philosopher for that discussion would be Hegel. So how Hegel thinks about it, to be pretty brief, is that you have a proposition, you call that proposition a thesis, and it encounters its anti-proposition, or what is called its antithesis, antithesis, and through their encounter, what you see is the emergence of a new idea, which is called the synthesis, which is an amalgamation of the two. Now, what happens then, and what I think sometimes gets forgotten, is that this synthesis, being an amalgamation of the two, becomes a new thesis against which a new antithesis is opposed. So that synthesis that we have there actually has parts of both the antithesis and the thesis that came before it. Both are moving forward, retaining some degree of the past that keeps informing this newness. So as much as it's about looking forward together, it is about also, in my mind, acknowledging that there is a past that you can, I guess, harken back to or think back to in order to better understand the predicament that you currently find yourself in and how it isn't dissociated from that past.
When you look at Hegel's work or any of the other guys that use this format as part of their way to explore subjects, do we think it could be useful in the exploration of the material that I'm interested in, rationality, irrationality, and how those two come together to make the human experience?
Maybe I could share an anecdote that isn't, it might not be what you expect. It might illuminate this in a certain way. Where if you take a video game and, people play video games online and they play against one another, of course, what often happens is that the whole upper echelon of players, like the best players, they seem to increase incrementally. That is, the skill level seems to increase. And it's not that often, and we can say the same thing about sports, that you get this like amazing outlier. Let's say basketball players now are probably better than basketball players 40 years ago. And that is, in many ways, a product of this dialectical encounter, in that there is learning occurring in this conflict, between teams, within teams, between various players, that incrementally increases skill level. Now, on a broader civilizational scope, in terms of Hegel, there is this belief that things are getting better and better and better and better through these various conflicts. And we see that as well with thinkers like Immanuel Kant in that there is this kind of faith in society and civilization as a whole. In terms of what you're discussing with, let's say, two people who have two different ideas and they want to come up with something new, it's a very difficult thing to imagine or maybe to motivate or catalyze, because we're so often stubborn in that we don't want to take that leap, because that would demand, in part, a recognition of our own faults. It would demand us saying part of this is right and part of what I'm saying is wrong, as well as the other person thinking that, which is just so difficult to motivate. And I don't know if this is a new thing. I don't know if it's just part of this human experience. It is something that really hinders the motivation for newness. And so we relegate it to various institutions and we're like, okay, we'll leave the real developments to the people in charge or stuff like that. And that really takes responsibility away from the possibility that you and I can have right here in developing something new.
Well, exactly. And I'm very interested in that. You know, I've spent a lot of time in public conversation with people. I often have found that with the internet, with the ability to publish quickly and iteratively, there is an opportunity to have some kind of like compounding development experience. So it's interesting when you were speaking about Hegel, it was like not the way that I had interpreted it. It was almost like Hegel's whole view of the way the world was developing was this kind of dialectic, whereas I'm thinking about it more in a small formal setting, in the sense that I was in a debate at Oxford Union. You have the proposition, opposition, and then a winner. I'm thinking about it more as a formal construct for a micro engagement. Whether this is how Hegel went about it, I guess what I've taken from it anyway is when I sit and have conversations with people like yourself, whether or not we both try to generate the thesis / pull it in from the previous bit of content and both try and build the antithesis and then both try to synthesize as best we can, or whether you take one role and I take the other and then we both join in at the end, or one of us tries to synthesize it. I don't really care who plays those roles, but I think that is the kind of conversation I'm interested in, that has, one, a sense we're both on the same team, and two, that there's a compounding nature. They're not individual pieces of content, but they follow on from each other, in the same way that I asked you to have a quick look at what we talked about the other day, so that you get the on-ramp basically to where we are today.
The alternative would be not to have the conversation and to just consume like ideas endlessly. But the thing is, if you do that, you will never actually have a conversation, because you'll never be satisfied that you've known enough to develop an adequate position from which to depart, from which to begin your ideas. So, and you can learn a lot more from discussing something than you can from reading something. Just physiologically, when you discuss something, you're engaging much more of your sensorial capacities that will help you retain the memory of the conversation more than just reading something.
And also there's a lot more to be gained. Like, I now get to know you and I get to publish something on my channel and get the comments back. And also my motivation to read goes up dramatically if there's a person involved. So for example, if you sell me on the idea, I really need to read this one chapter, one, you've taken down what is a whole book down to the one chapter I really need. So I feel more pertinence on reading that one thing, but also I want to do it for you. You know what I mean? I want to do it because you've suggested it, and that would be part of us developing our relationship. So I've learned that about myself, and that's one of the things that I love about this, basically, where relationship and conversation meets formality. It also, I think, hopefully makes it a bit safer. Hopefully the container of calling it some kind of dialectic container, I think, should enable as best as possible that sense of open-mindedness, where, you know, I'm not out to get you, I'm out to generate something. And the more new and the more connected we are, probably the better quality of conversation, at least for people who watch this channel who are like me. That's definitely exciting and needed. I mean, I don't see a lot of it really, you know, and I've unintentionally done a lot of that in the past, you know, with my public forums. And now I guess I'm finding a bit more formality to describe what I was doing naturally anyway. So I think we'll carry on as planned, and maybe we'll even get onto a bit of that subject today and look at both sides of it. But where we got to in the conversation with Tom was a sense that it is very difficult to enter that container without going through the door of, at least for the purpose of the conversation, an agreed definition of rationality, because I think that is the primary centerpiece, you know. Then we're discussing what is around that, what is not rationality, and then maybe we could come to a sort of a working definition of sorts.
Maybe it'd be good because you had that conversation, to kind of recap as much as you can.
This may take 5 minutes and it will be a little bit of a patchwork quilt. So bear with me and I'll try and summarize at the end, because this is, genuinely real-time stuff going on. So firstly, trying to categorize, before getting to the definition, different sort of fields that people are discussing. So for example, separating out epistemic rationality and instrumental rationality. What I understand by that is in theory or in practice. So being able to conceive in the mind of the rational thing to do versus actually being able to execute the rational thing in the real world. The other thing I learned about was bounded rationality, the concept that we never really have enough information. I guess it seems that the standard kind of economic definition, I think Gary Becker is the one whose name is associated with the standard economic definition of rationality, is that an individual will try to maximize its personal utility, and it doesn't take into account sentiment or emotion as part of utility. It's looking at product, like cold hard product. And from that conception of rationality, you have that economic model of Homo economicus, which is the rational man, the rational agent who behaves to maximize personal utility. So then you've got the behavioral economists, who are those that are concerned with, or Dan Ariely or Daniel Kahneman, who are concerned with the idea that we are not very good at being rational. Basically, he's saying that we ultimately make emotional choices based on emotional reasons. If you look at Dan Ariely, he doesn't try to expand the definition of rationality. He's quite happy with that limited economic model, but he's saying that doesn't define who we are. But their view is quite pejorative. I still think that the behavioral economists think that if we were acting perfectly, we would be entirely rational, yet we are bounded in our ability because we don't have all the information, and we have this almost defect of being emotional and making emotional decisions based on emotional things and relationships and stuff like that. Hence the big space there in our lives for the manipulation of marketing messages and stuff like that. Whereas I guess what I'm trying to say, and where I maybe come in from a kind of a Christian background, and that kind of intuitive self has been bolstered up a bit in my sense of identity, even though I've let go of some of that theology, that sense of what it means to be human is still there inside me, which is to say that actually maybe it's not a defective human trait that we have this part of us that is irrational, that acts intuitively or with subconsciously in Daniel Kahneman's system 1, system 2 type thinking. System 2 being the very conscious, labor intensive, slow process of making cognitive decision making. System 1 being this kind of automatic thing where you're just in the background, the tasks are pretty easy and you've done them before and you kind of know your way around naturally. The broad kind of background I came from has given me some natural sense that maybe this isn't a defect, that we have this irrationality. Yes, it can be defective. It can lead you away from the life you want, but actually some of the most valuable moments of explosive creativity, or where people love beyond what seems rational to the individual's utility, are actually the most exciting parts of what it means to be human. In my research and work on intelligence, I spent quite a bit of time at the beginning of that work explaining what intelligence is not. Intelligence is not consciousness. We're not discussing the same two things. Intelligence is not human intelligence. It is intelligence. We're looking at how a system engages with an environment in its kind of more theoretical sense. Just trying to get some shape around it. I'm aware of some of this work that's already out there. Because I'm primarily interested in what humans are like in their best moments, I am interested in instrumental rationality, because for me, instrumental rationality also has the sub-department of epistemic rationality within it. You have to be able to conceive of what's rational and then be able to action it. So I'm concerned with both of them because I'm interested in our real lives. And I guess we could go on at this point to discuss what I mean when I talk about beautiful, but I think that might be a secondary piece. I think I'm more interested to think around whether this economic definition is useful, and then maybe go on from there into the other parts of the conversation, if you will.
That sounds great to me, and there's a lot to chew on there. And I too am interested in this question about what makes a human human. And so one of the ways I like to think about that is that if there was like an alien species that came down to Earth from some planet, and we were to tell them or try to explain to them how humans are different from animals or how to differentiate them, we might have a little bit of a difficult time, assuming, of course, we can communicate with them. What would we say? Well, humans stand up on their 2 feet. They stand erect, which other animals don't. To which they might say, well, what about that baby I'm seeing on the ground crawling, or someone who might be maybe in a wheelchair with a disability? Are they not human? And we'd say, no. Well, we have to, these are exceptions. Or they might look at the bear standing up on its two legs and being like, well, is that a human? And then we say, no, there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. We say, well, humans have language. We can talk with our mouths. And then they might say, well, I hear those dolphins making these noises. Is that not a language? And we'd say, it's not a human language, though. And so what we end up doing is we have what would be like a tautological definition of what a human is, where we just say, a human is a human. And we know what a human is. We can recognize a human as they're different from a dog or a cat. There's one writer who I'm particularly fond of, who's Italian. His name is Roberto Kolasso. And there's one moment in one of his books when he says that for a long time, if a human confronted another human, as let's say you and I did this morning, that human would not have known if the thing they were confronting was like them, if they were an animal, if they were a god, if they were royalty, which was tantamount to being non-human, upper class tier for much of human history, meant that you weren't part of the human species. And then we can add to that, take a racist past that viewed, non-white people like following the slave trade in the United States. People who weren't white were considered less than human. So this idea about humanity it's tricky in that we have this idea about it, but don't necessarily know where it comes from. Now, in terms of this thing called rationality, I'm sure that most people are familiar with the Turing test. And in case someone isn't familiar with the Turing test, it's the test that if you were to put a human in conversation with a robot without being able to see them, like you have a wall or some kind of divider, and the human were to think the robot were a human, then it would pass the Turing test in that the robot were actually effective at conveying that it was a human or convincing them that it was a human. But that way of measuring what a human is does exactly what you don't want to do, David, in that you think that, or part of being human is associated not with your intellectual faculties, not with your rational faculties, your ability to communicate, anything like that. Instead, there's something more that involves emotion, that involves intuition, that can't be replicated by a robot. At least not yet, as far as I know. So
it would be the last bits to go. It would be the last bits to go if they were to go.
It would demand such an adaptive robot that it seems like unlikely. And of course, we fantasize about this possibility with science fiction, like Blade Runner, for example. They try desperately to imagine robots with emotions, almost like we're trying to expand this understanding of what it means to actually be human, because the fear isn't that something is going to be more rational than us. We, in part, are starting to fear that something can actually be quite emotional. And that's scary, in that the final moments of Blade Runner involve this android crying. And it's a very powerful scene, but it, in a sense, kind of absolutely bridges the human android divide.
Just on that, because you've inspired me, there's two things. One, the receiver of the information from the other being, that may be a machine, hearing and believing it's human, versus it actually having the kind of authenticity that we crave for in other humans. And I think the great constraint for biological existence, frankly, but humans within that paradigm, is death, is the fact that we know that very reliably we don't live much more than 100 years, very reliably. And so even if, whether you come from the human side or the machine side, if you lifted that great constraint, and if I said, David, you now get to live for 1,000 years, almost guaranteed, like 95% likely 1,000 years, how I would perceive your choices and how you engaged with me would just be entirely different, because you're living on an entirely different set of rules that constrain absolutely every choice. I mean, even today, you giving me an hour of your time of a Saturday morning when you're in your prime to choose to talk with me, that is a cost to you. That is 1 and a half hours or whatever of your life you don't get back. And that matters because you only have X amount of hours left. And it could be very few, or it could be thousands of hours left. But we all know there's that constraint that operates. So whether it's a human that you give a pill and they can live forever, or whether it's a robot who has high faculty for, let's say, the potential to appear to be engaging emotionally, I think ultimately that great constraint is the thing that gives authenticity to what these things that we value, these moments that we value. And that's why I think things like sacrificial love appear to have such a visceral connection to us, because underneath all of those things we value and those moments of great acts of creativity or love within that is because we all know that it's going to be over soon. And that's an amazing thing that they've done that. The presumption of everything being finite is not necessarily there in the machine world.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's something kind of divine about machines. There is not the same connection with finiteness in that domain. Assuming that we follow this kind of Christian tradition, God is infinite. So in that case, there is a kind of association here between how we are right now characterizing these robots, or what differentiates robots, androids, whatever, artificial intelligence from humans.
That's the whole game with the Christian story. If you buy into that, that is a difficult thing to square off, basically, the idea that the infinite becomes finite. And that's the whole, well, as my theologian friend calls it, that is the scandal of the particular. The idea that this thing happened in a particular moment of creation at this particular time with this particular embodiment of God. If Jesus really was, if he did really exist in that moment in time, and the history kind of the books and the Bible are relatively accurate, I think it is a wondrous and wonderful, divine kind of inspired expression of a humanity. But I don't think it's unique in history. So I'm looking for those examples today. Yeah, I'm looking for those moments of explosive, sacrificial, creative human lives, basically, that look entirely, essentially irrational to our limited understanding of what it means to live a human life. And maybe drawing back to this sort of Hegelian sort of way of seeing the dialectic, when those moments come along in civilization, it can bring up the whole team to a different level of understanding of where we could get to and what we can celebrate, which is why it's so important for me to hold this conversation, this extended conversation, to sort of see whether there is a sort of a space in our sense of identity that we've especially been neglecting since a lot of us have thrown away the theology that we were born into. As that slowly deteriorated in society, I think there may be something about our conception of what it means to be human that we've lost, that we need back, but not necessarily in theological terms. So let's get back to this definition then of rationality. I mean, do you have a conception of what rationality is, a way of describing it that's aside from the economic thing I put forward?
Not comfortably. And part of my own research dealing specifically with conspiracy theories, which is what my dissertation is on, confronted with this problem in that how do you differentiate rational inquiry or rational thought, rational questioning from irrational thought and irrational questioning. So as some of us may know, the philosopher René Descartes poses this problem in his first Meditations, in which he says, we don't know if we are living in a real world or if we are being duped by what is called the evil demon that is essentially put us in a simulation. And this is kind of the matrix.
The matrix.
And the process he goes by to prove that is that if he doubts everything, if he doubts whether or not, if I take myself as an example, if the shirt is real, if my body is real, the watch is real, my experiences are real. If I doubt all of that, what I am still left with is the act of me doubting. So Descartes is like, well, that means that you can't get rid of your thinking. Like, you're always going to be thinking, in that the last remaining thing, once you've doubted everything, is your capacity to still doubt, which you can't doubt away because it demands you to be doubting the doubt or your process of doubt. So this is where we get this idea. I think, therefore I am.
One question that it begs is, who is the I that is speaking in Descartes' story there? Because what I think often gets confused is whether it is David's mind that is speaking there, or whether it is David, the full human, that is speaking there. And I guess I would come to the conclusion at the moment that it is your mind that is speaking there. It is your system two, your slow, conscious thought life. It comes from this center of intelligence, not your gut intelligence. I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. It's hard to know sometimes where rationality ends and where irrationality begins. I think if I look at what I laid out at the beginning, I'm happy using this standard economic model, Becker's economic model of saying an agent's ability to maximize utility to themselves, and to think of that as a system engaging with its environment to maximize its goals. There's a few bits to that which I think become very important in the definition. So what is the system that is speaking, that is trying to maximize? Have we got the right system? And what is utility? And then also, what is the goal? And have we correctly understood the goals? There's an additional layer on top, really, which pulled from Heidegger around his work on being and time. He had a lovely phrase that I won't do well in paraphrasing now. We are the purveyors of being. We are not primarily some kind of doer. We are the purveyors or the protectors of being itself. And for me, when I found that in Heidegger, that gave great strength to what I already intuitively believe, that the doingness and the games of life, and that therefore within your basketball game earlier, there are goals, which is to score more baskets and prevent them going in your end. Those are all very, very good goals. And then you could try to rationally maximize utility towards those goals. But that is not what makes us human. And also sometimes when we think a narrative is representing a full human's story, actually I think it might only be describing the thinking, active, conscious part of that human. I'm just trying to get some clarity on the ingredients that go into those seemingly simple sentences, if you will.
For some reason, I keep thinking about this idea of consistency as being a marker of rationality, in that being consistent not only with your beliefs, but in how you act out those beliefs is, in a sense, a marker of rationality in my mind. But the thing is that rationality can lead you astray, because if you believe wholeheartedly in something that isn't going to actually produce the results that you want, then it's going to demand you going back to the drawing board. Now, if we can think of rationality, for argument's sake, we considered it in terms of consistency, but we allotted a little space, almost like a vaccine, of a possible mutation of that consistency. What we are doing is maintaining consistency, but recognizing that consistency might change. In Hegel's terms, this is how I understand it, to negate the negation. So if I'm consistent in my beliefs that exercising a lot is going to be good for my health, and then I read some study that's like, you know what, it's actually not that important. What is more important is that you have a good diet. Okay. So I switch gears here, and now I make my consistent practice being about eating a healthy diet. So what I have here is a move from one consistency to another. Now, we don't see those as being different in Hegel. In fact, we see them as being a consistency in terms of me remaining consistent, but the consistent thing I'm on about is different. So this is negating the negation. This is getting rid of the idea that there is a difference between the two things that are in fact the same.
It reminds me of the phrase where you say that the only constant is change in life. Kind of the sense of what is consistent is the adaptation, And I do think that really what it means to be human is to, well, sorry, no, I don't think that. I don't think what it means to be human is to be adaptive, but I do think that adaptivity is a core ingredient of what has allowed us to continue to flourish. And just to go back to the consistency and the construct essentially of rationality, if when we're talking about Heidegger and what is the point, basically, why are we here? What does it mean to be human? The best I've come to is the sense that life is not a game, it is a process. And the goal is to hold space for that process to emerge most fully as possible. And so to put that in more concrete terms, when I lived in the woods and you watch these flowers emerging, you don't make the flower grow. You know what I mean? You really don't make it go. And you actually don't know what it's going to exactly grow into. But what you can do is nurture the environment. I can make sure the soil's got the right ingredients and put the right coffee grounds in there to give it some more stuff. I can make sure the water's there, put them in the right place for the sun. And for me, my rationality I have to be quite conscious and quite intentional around my goal setting in order to make sure I acquire the utilities, literally the water and the stuff that I need to make sure the ground is fertile. But ultimately, the point is not to acquire water and good soil and shit. It is to allow that flower to grow however best it will grow. And I intentionally use the idea of a flower rather than of a potato plant, because obviously that's just a self-perpetuating utility thing around being able to eat something and continue to stay alive. For me, to see beautiful flowers fulfill that's all you want. It's going to die real quick, but it's just that you don't want it to die when it gets that big. You want it to die after it's just gone like that and had its moment in the sun. And now it can go, because if it were to stay forever, we would lose our value in it anyway. So it is that kind of aesthetic appreciation for the emergent qualities of life that can come if we are able to organize the right set of utilities using a lot of our cognitive and sort of rational scaffolding, if you will. So for me, that's where this ordering comes from, which is, I'm really genuinely, hopefully you can see now, not trying to throw that kind of rationality construct under the bus. I'm not trying to say let's all live in chaos. We need that training and that capacity, but it's not the point. We play games in life, but the point's not the games. The point is those emergent moments of creativity that if we set ourselves up well enough for long enough, we have a chance to see a few of them pop up here and there. And sorry, that's a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of where you led me to with that.
I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Immanuel Kant, but in his third critique, the critique of judgment, he really lays into this question, and that is whether or not the world is beautiful for a reason, or there are beautiful things in the world for a reason. So we look upon a plant, or a flower, I should specify, and it's hard to think that the flower is beautiful just for no reason. And Kant says, well, it seems like there's almost an attachment between the human capacity to see and the thing that they're seeing, such that it produces this sense of awe. Because we see a beautiful flower, and it's hard to imagine that someone couldn't be moved by it. And it follows a certain process. And I think that there is a tendency to look upon the natural world as being like chaotic or wild, not having this kind of order, when in fact, it is extremely ordered. Everything is ordered in nature. And, looking at German idealism, like what they were doing was trying to look at nature for proof of God because of the ordering that they were seeing happening there. Everything was ordered to such an extent, yet it is the space in which such beautiful things emerge. So this idea that your input into this flower, as someone that's administering a kind of possible ordering to it, and that you know what to do to give a fertile place for this flower, is going to be the thing that elicits beauty.
One other part I wanted to say, if I can recall it, is this sense, and you touched on it there, around what appears to be irrational versus what is irrational. We may observe something in another human that appears to be so irrational simply because we can't understand the rationale for it. I mean, if you look at those three ingredients we laid out earlier, we don't fully understand what the system is that we're looking at. We don't understand the kind of utility they're interested in, or we don't really understand their goal. And maybe that lack of comprehension of what we think we do understand in another actually leads us to the belief that something is irrational, when actually they were being very rational to their sense of identity and their goals, but we just can't comprehend maybe one or two or three of those ingredients. I do have a bias and an aspiration towards this sort of beautiful irrationality, putting value on something I think that's being deeply undervalued in ourselves and in society.
So like, what would some examples be of the beautiful irrational?
I do think sacrificial love, not just do unto others as you wish to be done to yourself, but significant individual loss for the sake of let's call them an outsider, somebody with little or no influence or power in your world. So you're not achieving utility for yourself through the group. Because, if I do something nice for someone in my family that's a little kid, I'm going to receive the value back long term through the group dynamic, through the community, if you like. those acts of sacrificial love that have significant cost, even unto death in the archetypal manner, if you are looking at the system as an individual person who has a goal of like making a good life of some kind, and they're trying to maximize utility of that, it's hard to perceive that act as a rational act, yet it creates something deeply aspirational, something heroic, something wonderful to aspire to and to be proud to be a part of in the group context sort of thing. And equally, like if we were to consider explosive moments of creativity with an artist or an engineer, a creative of some kind, if we think about the flow state and what people experience the flow state to be, I'm not sure if you're familiar with flow
No.
state. There's a bunch of guys in California associated with the Esalen Institute and that kind of Big Sur area, very hippie kind of beatnik history, who are really interested in peak human experience. And they talk about the flow state being this experience you have where time dissolves, where the work becomes effortless, where you're kind of doing and being merged, where you are basically, in my words, in the jam. It feels easy, yet the value is potentially seen as high to others, and you feel very alive because you're just in the flow. It is easy for you to do these things. A lot of the structure seems to go whoop, like, think our normal kind of perception of experience goes funny at that stage. In that kind of flow state where you're in a room with or creating yourself potentially highly creative products from this experience, it's hard to conceive of that as a rational experience. You could say it's very rational for me to book time in my diary to allow myself to zone out into that state, because I know long term I get paid lots for writing books, and I can only write good books if I get myself into a flow state. The setting aside of the time, I think, can be seen as a very rational endeavor, but actually the process by which that creativity is emerging is not at all rational. It's entirely getting rid of the critical mind and the critique. You know what they say, like write drunk and edit sober. Similar kind of thinking about what it takes to be entirely creative. So for me, those are the two areas in life where love goes way beyond kind of a sense of any personal utility, and where creativity goes way beyond the thinking self. They're the two things I think that we really need in our conception of humanity that aren't found within the bounds of rationality, and certainly aren't subordinate to what it means to be the rational man.
The experience that comes to mind for me is like driving for several hours. You go into a kind of a daze. Several hours goes by, several hundred kilometers, miles or whatever, and you're suddenly somewhere else, and you're like, how did I get here?
And it's actually a highly complex task. You're driving a car with gears and you're going 50 miles an hour. It's dangerous. Things are happening, yet somehow you're listening to music or you're in a thought experience, and time goes a little bit warpy, and boom, all of a sudden, as you said, you're just there. When we engage with that with someone else, that is actually some of the stuff that makes some of the best moments and memories, right? So if I were with you in that car and we were having that conversation, and we all of a sudden both appeared at the other end of this 3-hour journey on the other side of a mountain range, I think you and I would both find that to be remarkably valuable in our journey together. We'd be like, wow, that was cool, and we'll never forget it. To try and bring a little bit of curation so we don't get completely lost here, because we're covering some good stuff. I am led back to not wanting to try and extend the definition of rationality from the economic model. I think that is a good basis. What maybe I need to do next is, as you've led me on to there, how to define the difference between what I was referring to as painful irrationality at the bottom of the kind of human experience, things that you're not desiring, that kind of reactivity. So you're not able to consider what's good for you long term, and you just act out of a reactive place. Take rationality out of the equation now, if we've got a basis for it. What's the difference between beautiful irrationality and painful irrationality? I probably need to put some thought into that. And you've led me to refer to a couple of case studies, which I think do stand up. And maybe I should explain a couple of the kind of irrational experiences that we don't want to see anymore. Actually, you may have something to say about that end of it with your media PhD around people being able to be manipulated by certain messages.
The ways that certain media images or advertising images are constructed are meant exactly to hit onto what you aren't immediately conscious of, and that's what makes them really effective. For example, Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, kind of famously taught the world that in order to sell pianos, you don't sell the people pianos, you sell them the idea of a piano room. So now you're selling them a kind of cultural icon, of kind of a marker of pecuniary decency, of being like upper class, which is then a lot more enticing, and it doesn't feel like someone's selling you something, which is often quite berating. It feels kind of brazen, and it's like, get out of my face. Now it feels like it's their own choice, which is what makes it so much more effective. Like, you sell the piano room and the pianos will follow. So
Wait, can we just pause for a second? Pecuniary decency, is that what you said?
yeah, it just means like looking good for like others, like being of a high level of repute, being respected, I
I like
guess.
it. That one's going in. I'm having that one. But I agree. Yeah, to make it feel less of a hardcore sell, you're selling the idea above the transaction, which then they feel that they've got more agency and they're not being bullied into the transaction. There's more agency for themselves in that. But actually, you've gone deep into their aspirations, really, of what it means to have a good life. And then the transaction comes as a natural consequence. So I can see that entirely.
Then it gets difficult, right? Because at the same time, the kind of irrationality you're vying for, that you're advocating for, does something similar, but it doesn't draw upon an exterior source. So when you're describing someone being drunk when they write, or we're just describing a situation in which someone tries to break down their kind of egotistical barriers in order to arrive at something within themselves that they can only chime into when they're in a kind of dream state, maybe a dream within a dream, as I think Edgar Allan Poe said. You arrive at something that is not for something else. And I guess that could be a marker of the difference here. Even if that thing that you're doing, that you even take from yourself, I would be a little bit skeptical or suspicious of it if you're like, I need to chime into this thing so that I can get like rich and famous or something.
Yeah.
Then it's like, well, is that really for you? Because now you're associating it with this exterior thing, and it seems to not be good in itself. And I think
Yeah.
part of the appeal is not what it can offer you, this thing that you're describing, but the experience of it itself.
Well, I think that it's exactly that, if there is utility, it is not known yet what that utility is for you or for somebody else. And for me, that relates back to not having a clear goal. So I really like what you've said, because as you were talking about the piano guy, right, I was thinking about Facebook, thinking that that is the whole construct that Facebook now have. You live inside their piano shop, and you may think that you are a free agent, but you are in a designed experience, especially when I wear my VR goggles and I go in to Facebook on my VR headset, Oculus. It's like I literally am inside their piano shop, and they're selling me pianos left, right, and center. But I feel like I'm an independent person. It's my account, my data. But we all know social dilemma and all the rest, that we are getting led down the garden path with that. I think what you've said there about it is not for something else. You arrive at something that is not for something else. I think that's a really good point. And anytime there's a business involved, there's another point. And even in our own journeys, there's often another point, because like I said, in the raised bed, if I'm battling on the hierarchy of needs, I'm more likely to plant a potato than I am to plant a flower that will just give aesthetic. To me, at least, there's not kind of a clear goal or objective, because I've got other stuff I've got to do. And unfortunately, a lot of people spend a lot of their time just grappling with that stuff. And I only say unfortunately, because I wish for every human to have these moments of flow state, the ability to be surprising and emergent. And maybe the more I look at this, more I realize actually it happens a lot with people who are under great stress and tension, actually, that there's more of it that happens in refugee camps and on the edges of society than it does in the middle or upper class. Maybe that's something I'll learn on this journey. But I know that there takes quite a lot of construct and order to create the safety to allow these moments to occur where something, as you say, you arrive at something for its own end, not for something else. I have been the beneficiary and of a privileged life that has, take this room right now, it's safe. There's nobody coming in and out. I can have an uninterrupted conversation with you for an hour and a half and allow ourselves to get to as high a possible place as we can, because partly the construct of the conversation, partly I sense checked you on YouTube, and partly because I'm lucky enough to live in my own apartment and have that safety to not feel like the door's going to get knocked down. So there is this converse or interesting relationship between safety and the nurtured ground. And I think that safety often comes from highly ordered, highly rational kind of constructs where you're really trying to think ahead, think for the long term about what is best, what those conditions are. And that's my final point on this ramble, is to say, that's why I do think on the issue of how do we organize society, we should be aiming for a highly rational way of organizing society so that these other moments can occur that surprise us and would not be obviously seen as rational in the meantime, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that relates in part to this idea earlier about like vaccination, where you want to create a situation in which you can allow elements that aren't a part of that situation or that allowed you to arrive there, like this irrationality, to emerge. And that would be like this beautiful irrationality, to allow these moments that don't necessarily abide by the kind of, just say, more strict or more rigid kind of coded structures that are required to arrive there. For example, making sure people have enough food to eat and water to drink and shelter and stuff, like basic things that demand a gigantic bureaucratic ordered system to arrive at that point, which then can allow for these other experiences en masse. Like we can have them now. But like as you said, you know, it's for those people that aren't worried about like feeding their kids or having a rocket fly through their ceiling.
Yeah, exactly. I see it actually every time as well that people come to see me in the woods. I have this little woodland set up, a little cabin off grid. Every single time, especially when they come for the first time, I watch the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy, get kind of reset because they have no map for what they're coming into. They are trying to cover off their basic human needs before we ever get the moment that I'm looking for, which is to sit around the fire and to jam up some good stuff, some new stuff, some interesting stuff. And so, yeah, they're asking, have I got somewhere to sleep? Is there a toilet? Where does my bag go? Where do I belong? Like, do I have a bed? Where's the food? Is it going to get cooked? Are we going to get stabbed in the dark? They have to take an hour to square those things off before they can start rising up the ranks. You're right on the macro level, but I think also the woods operates as like a micro kind of example.
You know, we take a lot of these things for granted too. Those people that actually have these needs met. And there's an example in Heidegger where he's talking about the hammer, and you know, you're using the hammer in your day-to-day acts, and you never think about the hammer. But when the hammer breaks, your entire world falls apart. You're like, what am I going to do now that I don't have this thing? Like suddenly you're contemplating this thing that was non-existent to you. Like for all intents and purposes, it was an extension of you in that it just so seamlessly fit with your hand. And then suddenly it just wasn't there anymore.
Well, Alan Watts says a similar thing about the eyeball. You know, he says, when your eye works well, you don't notice it. You only really notice your eye when it starts to malfunction. You know, it is the method by which you see the world, and the job is for it not to be seen until it starts to go a bit sideways. Have you watched The Mandalorian? Just on a quick side note.
A bit of it. I think I watched the first season.
Did you see the end of the first season with the nurse bot? For me, it was like a beautifully reductive kind of example of everything we're talking about. The nurse bot was this like skinny robot that spins around with its arms like that. And originally it was out there doing the same job as the bounty hunter, to do stuff in the world, to go and get things, to go and achieve tasks or whatever. Then it got broken, and that the little guy who says, I have spoken, he remade him, rewired him literally, and taught him to be a nurse. So the rewiring, the rebirth, if you like, was not around this goal set of acting in the world and conquering. It was around care. Then fast forward to the end of the season where they're trying to save baby Yoda, and they're on this little punting boat in fields of lava. And this is where the nurse bot has its big moment, because the stormtroopers he sees are outside hiding behind the cave. And he has this like basic wiring question of, I promised I would stay with the child, but only if I could save the child, you know, and now I have to ask myself, am I to self-destruct or am I to stay alive? I can't do it better justice, but it was, in the end, it was the rewiring of his sort of compassionate demeanor that led him to get out of the boat, walk through the lava in this like heroic sacrificial love, basically in my language, and then self-detonate, clear out all the stormtroopers, and then they were able to sail through. And for me, there was something transcendent about that. And, you know, if you go nature and nurture, his nature in the original design of his DNA or his wiring, his circuitry, was to go and do shit in the world. But then through some process, he found a higher like plane of existence. And it's a bit of a stretch, you know, to say that that's like, because in actual fact, it seemed very rational what he did in the end, because it was towards the goal of saving Baby Yoda. Put it this way, there were two goals that were now present in his sort of thinking, if you like. I don't know, it just really touched me. And that was the irony of the whole thing. I actually like really felt touched by watching it, and it felt quite transcendent, even though it was like the most robotic version.
That's a great example. And like when Immanuel Kant was wondering about what morality is, which is a very difficult question, he couldn't come up with an answer because it's difficult to lay out what an actual truly moral act is. And so he says that it's, you know, it's not moral if you're doing it for like another reason. It's not moral if you save someone so that you can get a bunch of money or become famous or something, because then it's taking it from itself, from being moral itself. But this is really one of the great mysteries of human life that I can think of, is that people still do moral things. We have this propensity to do, in that case, like a sacrificial act, even though it's a robot. But we see this play out over and over again, where people do things that is totally against all of their self-interest, their bodily self-interest, their economic self-interest, whatever, in order to do something that they know to be right. And that is really, you know, of course, it's a very beautiful thing. And it is totally irrational if we define rationality as being self-preservation. It reveals that there is something more, in a sense, that moves us beyond ourselves to some kind of transcendence. Whether or not that transcendence is beyond all human experience, or if it's just about transcending your personal individuality to be among other humans, to do something for humans. And so it's still bound by civilization or by culture, by the world, or whether it's bestowed upon us by some god, who knows? But it is a fascinating mystery, a fascinating thing that keeps occurring.
And I think that an area that we may explore more in these conversations, back to the sort of appearance of irrationality, but really isn't, it might just be a different sense of identity to the individual that we begin with. We begin with that sense of self, or that beginning of the definition of a human identity being this meat sack I exist in at the moment.
We are comprised of multiplicities. We experience the world individually. That is, we experience the world through our senses. This explains why you might not like tomatoes or something, while I like tomatoes. One explanation as to why that might be the case is just the fact that we have different senses that are processing this tomato. So when we experience a thing, we aren't experiencing it itself. Like, that thing is always mediated through our senses. Despite that, we still have the capacity to organize, to form a community, to have consensus about things in the world. And we take it for granted that we have the same experience with things, when in fact we have wildly different ones. Yet despite that, something is able to connect us and to make us part of an organic whole that extends beyond us, yet that derives from us individually, as all individuals forming a cohesive mass.
And that's an amazing thing, really, isn't it? And you're right, it's easy to take for granted the amount of progress we've made, really, and the fact that we're still here as well. I mean, done pretty well. Coming into land, just reflecting now, I mean, I've had a brilliant time and I'm enjoying and feel there's value in what we're discussing. It's been slightly, probably a good thing. Again, that might be the slightly more flow state vibes where maybe more value is getting created, but I haven't been too conscious about trying to move the conversation through these three parts we've described. But interestingly, I do feel the spirit of the goal of synthesis has been present in the conversation, if you will, even though we haven't tried to describe the thesis and the antithesis and create a synthesis. I do think there's been a spirit of that, and there's a spirit of movement. I think from this conversation, I could start the next conversation with a clear definition of rationality, a small crystallized sense of what that is. Now we've kind of introduced some of the stuff around beautiful irrationality in the area, and I could probably try and get that crystallized in the next conversation and bring in what it means to do painful irrationality. And I wonder whether I might do well to speak with a psychologist around behaviors they've seen that hurt people. Maybe a conversation around pain would be useful to try and get a difference between the sense of beauty and also the relationship, I guess, between beauty and pain, because it's not that there isn't a relationship there. There certainly is. I mean, some beautiful art comes from pain. And actually, it can be the most exciting thing when something beautiful comes out of something terrible. And equally, the other way around is traumatic. So that's what feels like the natural momentum from our conversation. Is there anything else you think I should be considering at this time, or looking at, a little bit of reading or something like that? Anything I'm very open to.
Not off the top of my head. I think that the psychologist idea is good. At least getting someone who might have more of a better understanding about human motivation, both physiologically and socially.
What do you mean physiologically, by the way, when you say, oh, actually understanding how the body, like,
Yeah.
neurochemically responds to stimulus and reward and things like that?
Yeah. The idea that appears the most sensible to us, that appears to be the most appealing, how that is motivated by our physiological situation, and then therefore delineating or establishing the limits to that,
Mm-hmm.
which can then bridge us into this possible beautiful irrationality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we take down these barriers? How do we take down these possible hindrances to our living in the moment, so to speak?
Again, I'm trying to be honest about my biases in this conversation, if you will, because it's clear that I have a sense of value of this beautiful irrationality thing, and I'm wanting it to be something that we can meaningfully attain to. I think it's there. I believe it intuitively to be true. And I'm kind of looking, is there enough science and established objective thought, well, trying to be objective thought, that can kind of ratify it. But what I hope to see is that, back to the original dialectic kind of thing, I hope to see that our base lower self, our irrational nature, and then the development of the rational power are both requisite ingredients for these moments that we aspire for. I don't want to get to a position where you're like, nah, it's about getting rid of one of them so the other one can do the job of making us human. That just doesn't feel right. Hopefully I can find a conversation that helps lead us down that path a bit further.
If you're looking to YouTube other more like philosophically inclined people than myself, that can certainly contribute to that conversation as well, especially people more versed in maybe ethics, philosophy of mind, stuff like that, that would be able to really contribute to, I guess, that conversation about maintaining an equilibrium between both rationality and this idea of irrationality. And to just not say that like irrationality is something that's bad or intuition is something that's bad. And in fact, the only reason we have the capacity to have rationality is because we exist in a world that we interact with emotionally. And it's a world that we kind of inhabit in a very non-rational way. It affects us. We have deep emotional responses that we can't just dissociate from. We would commit a violence to ourselves to try and just essentially become these automatons, like these kind of robotic artificial intelligences just kind of floating around, like as though there's no substance here, like there's no irrationality.
A massive thank you, because even just not just the quality of conversation, content that you've brought to the table, and some serious reading if people want to go down those rabbit holes from the things that you've mentioned, but also your way of conducting yourself in conversation. I really appreciate, the kind of, I think you've embodied what I'm hoping to find in the attitude or nature of the style of conversation I hope to continue on. I hope you found me to be similar towards you as well. But also the excitingness of how we've managed to arrange this in a couple of days, from seeing a video on YouTube to being here, having this meaningful exchange. That's so exciting about the world that we're in these days, that this is possible, that you can go from not knowing someone's existence to reading some of their work, watching some of their work, and then being here. And then hopefully now this will become part of a longer body of work. So thank you so much for participating. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I was very excited to do it. I was very excited for your content as well. And I'm very curious to see how this all plays out, this whole series or whatever it turns into.
Thank you. Thank you. And hoping that we'll keep these rolling over the next few months, keep it developing. I can already feel that there is the momentum. And that's the other exciting thing, I think. Having found it so easy to connect with you, it makes me feel it's likely that I will continue to find lots of contributors and collaborators to take it on in different ways, and we'll build up this container over time. Are there any other links that you want to mention that people can find you out if people want to link into your world? What's your surname, by the way? I didn't know how to say it.
Guignol.
Guignol. Okay, nice.
Yeah, it's strange.
Where's it from?
The Guernsey Islands, I believe.
Oh, really? Okay.
I didn't know how to spell it for a very long time, maybe embarrassingly long. Yeah, it's a strange name, but if anyone wants to follow me or try to get in contact with me, you can do that via Instagram, probably the most easily, at theory_and_philosophy. Or if you find my YouTube channel, just Theory and Philosophy, you'll be able to find my email in the About section. And that's about it.
Hopefully we'll speak again.
Great. Thanks, David.